In China, the Gobi Desert expands by about 3,000 square kilometers each year. When news first came out that China was burying straw and planting trees deep in its deserts, the world was skeptical. Environmentalists warned it would fail. People doubted the feasibility of the idea. Scientists called it wasteful. Critics laughed at what seemed like a desperate and misguided attempt to green the unplantable desert. How could forests possibly grow in sand? For years, skeptics pointed to failed plantings and mocked China's ambition. But behind the scenes, something extraordinary was quietly, patiently, and relentlessly taking shape. Now, 10 years later, those same critics regret their doubts. Before the world watched China plant forests in the desert, it was witnessing something far more alarming: a country slowly being swallowed by sand. Desertification, the degradation of fertile land into dry, lifeless desert, was more than just an environmental problem. By the late 20th century, it had become a national emergency threatening food security and human survival in large parts of China. The roots of this crisis go back to the decades after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. Population growth and industrialization caused a dramatic increase in land exploitation. The sand and dust mainly came from land damaged in four ways: overgrazing by livestock, aggressive deforestation to meet with demands, unsustainable farming methods, and weakening of the land's ability to hold nutrients and moisture. Soil erosion worsened as protective vegetation disappeared, and strong northern winds swept across exposed land, carrying away the vital topsoil. By the early 2000s, it was estimated that more than 2.6 million square kilometers, over 27% of China's land, was affected by desertification. The worst-hit areas were in northern and northwestern China, including Inner Mongolia, Gansu, Ningxia, and Xinjiang, where grassy steppes and farmlands were rapidly turning into barren sands. Perhaps the most frightening was the Taklamakan Desert, known as the Sea of Death. One of the largest sandy deserts in the world, it had already swallowed ancient trade routes and towns centuries ago. In modern times, it continued to expand eastward, threatening infrastructure and causing powerful sandstorms that choked cities like Beijing and Lanzhou. In 2006 alone, China experienced 17 major sandstorms, with dust clouds traveling as far as South Korea and Japan, and in some cases even reaching the west coast of the United States. The human cost was severe. An estimated 400 million people lived in or near desertified zones. Crops failed, wells dried up, and villagers were forced to leave ancestral lands. Entire communities in He and Inner Mongolia relocated, making China one of the few countries to officially recognize ecological migrants, people displaced because their homes became unlivable due to environmental collapse. This crisis was also a political dilemma for a rising global power determined to demonstrate technological and economic strength. Such widespread environmental damage threatened not only the people but also China's credibility on the world stage. China needed a bold, visionary project, not just a temporary fix, to reverse decades of damage. From this existential crisis, the idea of building a green Great Wall emerged, a vast man-made forest to stop the desert's advance. Despite sandstorms and skepticism, China launched one of the largest ecological engineering projects in human history. Faced with the growing desertification crisis, China's leadership realized small efforts would not suffice. They needed an unprecedented large-scale environmental strategy. In 1978, they launched the 3 North Shelter Forest Program, often called the Great Green Wall. This mega-project became the largest deforestation campaign in history. The goal was ambitious: plant a massive belt of trees across the arid and semi-arid regions of northern China, covering 3 regions: northeast, north, and northwest China, hence 3 North. The plan aimed to create a living, breathing barrier against the expanding deserts, especially the Gobi and Taklamakan, which were advancing toward more populated and fertile areas, designed to unfold in 8 phases over 73 years. From 1978 to 2050, the project planned to rehabilitate over 35 million hectares of land. 87 million acres of degraded land were targeted. The intended forest zone would stretch over 4,500 kilometers in length and 1,500 kilometers in width, forming a massive arc along China's northern frontier. But this was not just a tree planting campaign. It was a national mobilization. The project combined top-down central planning with grassroots participation. Local governments were given mandates to plant and protect forests, while national policies offered incentives to encourage participation. Starting in the 1980s, the government introduced programs like the Grain for Green program, which compensated farmers for converting eroded farmland back to forest or grassland. Citizens were encouraged and sometimes required to contribute through tree planting quotas in schools, workplaces, and military units. Even cultural efforts were involved. In 1981, China established National Tree Planting Day on March 12th, a holiday that inspired mass participation in reforestation efforts. This helped build momentum and turned the project into a patriotic act of environmental restoration. As the initiative developed, the government began investing in scientific research, monitoring systems, and satellite tracking to oversee forest health, tree survival rates, and ecological impacts. The project's scope was vast. New species had to be selected to withstand harsh conditions, irrigation systems were tested and adjusted, and innovative techniques such as straw checkerboards and soil conditioners were introduced in later phases. Importantly, the Great Green Wall was not limited to forests alone. The strategy included agroforestry, grassland restoration, shrub zones, and desert-resistant crops to ensure long-term success. Planners recognized that a diverse ecological approach would be more resilient than monoculture forests. By the early 2000s, aerial images began showing promising results. Patches of green were appearing on previously barren land. Despite high failure rates in some areas and ongoing skepticism, the campaign continued slowly and steadily, gaining national pride. However, even as China pushed forward with determination, many around the world and numerous experts viewed the plan as unrealistic, naive, and doomed to fail. The project was mocked internationally. Planting trees in the desert, one of Earth's harshest environments, was widely seen as an ecological fantasy. Many experts, both inside China and abroad, believed the project was destined to fail. The early years did little to inspire confidence. Satellite images from the late 1980s and 1990s showed that large areas of newly planted forests had withered and died. Entire sections of desert plantations had become ghost groves, bare, dry, and lifeless. Critics highlighted alarmingly high tree mortality rates, estimated between 50% and 85% in some regions. These losses were devastating for a project of this scale and reinforced the narrative that China was fighting a losing battle against nature. Environmental scientists raised serious concerns. Many planted trees were non-native species such as poplar and pine. While the project launched in 1978 showed some positive results, these species lacked the natural hardiness to survive in harsh conditions. Without adequate water, nutrients, or biodiversity, these monoculture forests were vulnerable to disease, pests, and drought. Moreover, critics argued that planting the wrong species could further degrade the soil and create long-term ecological imbalances, potentially replacing one environmental problem with another. Public commentary was harsh. International media often described the project as green theater, a symbolic effort focused more on appearance than real results. Western headlines questioned the project's scale and sincerity, with some calling it a waste of public funds. Foreign development experts criticized China's reliance on mass mobilization and top-down mandates, arguing such methods were unsustainable without deeper environmental reforms. Even within China, there were dissenting voices. Some local ecologists criticized the campaign for prioritizing quantity over quality, celebrating the number of trees planted without tracking how many survived. Others warned that in some regions, tree planting was reducing water availability for nearby farmland. The desert seemed not so easily tamed, and many doubted that any amount of planting could hold it back, both metaphorically and literally. The world laughed. The phrase, burying money in the sand, became a common criticism, symbolizing how foolish and outdated the effort seemed. For a time, China became a case study in misguided environmental ambition, an example of how not to green the planet. Yet despite the laughter and criticism, China did not give up. Instead, it doubled down on its efforts, sending teams of workers and scientists into the desert to begin what would become the most unlikely environmental transformation in modern history. The technical work began while the world ridiculed China's dream of turning deserts into forests. Thousands of workers, engineers, and volunteers quietly rolled up their sleeves and got to work. The early stages of the Great Green Wall were not driven by sophisticated technology or billion-dollar budgets. They were powered by persistence, ingenuity, and simple but effective tools that could operate in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. One of the most ingenious methods developed during this phase was the straw checkerboard technique, created in the 1970s by Chinese desert researchers. This involved laying bundles of straw in a grid pattern across sand dunes to create a stabilizing framework. These straw grids, usually 1 meter by 1 meter, significantly reduced wind speed at the surface and prevented the sand from shifting. Over time, the checkerboards also helped retain moisture, encouraged the accumulation of dust particles, and allowed hardy desert plants to take root. The raw material for these grids came from an unexpected source: China's vast rice industry. Each year, the country produced over 200 million tons of leftover rice straw, a farming byproduct often burned or discarded in desert regions. However, it became a lifeline. Workers hauled truckloads of rice straw into the desert, manually spreading it across vast areas of shifting dunes, especially in critical regions like the edges of the Taklamakan Desert, where sand regularly threatened roads, villages, and railways. At the same time, National Tree Planting Day became a cornerstone of China's mobilization efforts and eventually a national tradition. Between 1982 and 2021, an estimated 78.1 billion trees were planted by volunteers, schools, military units, government offices, and civic organizations. The event became a visible symbol of China's environmental commitment. The actual planting process was grueling. Workers dug holes in unforgiving soil, often under extreme temperatures with limited water access. In many areas, irrigation had to be improvised using tanker trucks or hand-dug trenches. Since many desert soils lacked organic content, soil amendments such as compost, clay, and loam were sometimes added to improve water retention. These early years were about laying the foundation, both literally and figuratively, for future success. While not all trees survived, the straw checkerboards began to anchor dunes. In some pilot zones, sand movement was reduced by up to 99.5%, allowing planted vegetation to survive. The process was slow and labor-intensive but effective. Progress was made 1 square meter at a time. Yet as workers toiled in the sand, new challenges emerged. The hostile environment was unforgiving, and tree survival rates remained very low. Critics grew louder. The desert seemed far from defeated, and the hardest days were still ahead. Despite the early momentum of China's Great Green Wall campaign, the challenges of taming the desert became more difficult than anyone expected. The deserts China was trying to green were not passive stretches of land, but dynamic, hostile environments shaped by centuries of wind, drought, and shifting sands. The Taklamakan, Gobi, and other major deserts received as little as 10 millimeters of rainfall annually, with some areas going months or years without significant precipitation. Temperatures fluctuated wildly, from scorching 45 degrees Celsius summers to minus 20 degrees Celsius winters. This made tree survival extremely difficult. In many early afforestation zones, young saplings planted during tree planting drives died within their first year. The soil was loose, sandy, and nutrient-poor, unable to hold water. Even where irrigation was applied, moisture quickly evaporated or drained away. In the worst-hit regions, up to 85% of trees failed to survive, especially those planted in monocultures such as poplar or pine, which were not suited to desert conditions.